Hi, friends. This is Ron Nate, president of the Idaho Freedom Foundation. This is the Idaho Freedom Legislative Update on X-Space. Welcome to our second edition. Looks to be a good one here. We have a lot to talk about after 2 weeks of the legislative session, heading into week number 3. We'll talk a little bit about budget today, a little bit about libraries, a little bit about school choice. And I'll just start by reminding everyone just how big our budget is. I was in the legislature starting back in 2015, and in that legislative session, the state budget was approaching $7 billion. This last legislative session, they closed with a $3.8 billion budget. And so in just, 8-9 years, it has nearly doubled in Idaho. And so if you double in 8 or 9 years, you're talking 11% growth on average. Is that right? No, you're talking about 8% growth on average. That's a lot of growth in our state budget. Since 2020, we have taken in $22 billion from the federal government for COVID and all sorts of other things. And it's gotten to the point where in our state spending, in our government spending in the state of Idaho, 43% of it is represented by the federal government. That is not a recipe for sovereignty. That is not a recipe for federal solvency. They're either printing that money or they're borrowing that money, but either way, it hurts you. You're going to be paying interest, or you're going to be paying for it in terms of inflation, which means that your dollar is worth less. There's a lot more to talk about on budgets. I'm going to turn the floor over to Niklas Kleinworth, who has been tracking JFAC like a hawk for these last 2 weeks. And he has some developments to share with you about the budgeting process and what we can expect in the next few weeks in the Joint Finance and Appropriations Committee. Niklas, you ready to go?
I think so, Ron. Can you hear me all right?
You're good.
Hey, so there were a lot of big things that really happened in JFAC the last couple of weeks, and it's actually it's a refreshing change compared to years past and with other chairmen in charge of that committee, because JFAC's really kind of taking charge of the budget and taking charge of these agencies that have just kind of run amok of the process and generally use it as a rubber stamp for their budgeting process. One of the big things that happened in that regard was a couple weeks ago, Chairman Wendy Horman, she said that they would not be considering the budget for the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare's Indirect Support Services Division. And for those of you who aren't familiar with how they split up the budgets, that's the grouping in the budget process where they deal with, they're basically the hub for the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare. They deal with the office administration, they deal with IT, HR, all of those essential services. And she said that they're not going to even consider funding that division unless they address the audit findings that came out late last year regarding their misuse and overspending of dollars. And so they're holding the bureaucracy accountable already, it seems. And so it'll be interesting to see what qualifies as a good plan of action for dealing with those audit findings that JFAC finds satisfactory. Other things that have been in the news include looking at maintenance budgets separately from line items. And the idea there is that we fund the government just to keep the lights on, and then we can make rescissions and unfortunately additions in some cases later on. And what that does is it allows more spirited debate on those changes in the budget, instead of saying, oh, well, we support the agency, so we got to fund all of their requests, where we can have legislators kind of be able to more critically look at the budget. We've also been looking at things like the general funding accounting. So the governor over the last few years has just hidden spending in transfers. So basically all the money that you pay in taxes as Idahoans goes to the general fund. And then from there, things get distributed. And what the governor does is he takes a bunch of money right off the top before it goes anywhere. And goes into special dedicated funds that are dedicated to projects. They're not really stabilization funds. They're not really rainy day funds. They're project funds. They're spending funds. And so it's a way to make it look like spending from the general fund isn't growing as fast as it actually is. And Fred actually has been Fred's been tracking this issue for a long time, and saying that we needed to start looking at these transfers as hidden spending. And so I'll actually pass it off to Fred for some additional comments on that, because he's been doing some great research on that.
Thanks, Niklas. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great. So Niklas was referring to the transfers. And an easy way to think about this, if you're running a business and you're selling product and you give people a discount, that's a reduction in your revenue. But if your expenses go up, say for labor or maybe even for your materials, that's an expense. And you can't use that change as a reduction in revenue because it's not revenue, they're separate. But what the governor's been doing is he has taken expenses and he uses a transfer mechanism, as Niklas explained, to reduce the revenue line, the net revenue line. So it makes the spending look smaller. And so I did an analysis of that. And under this governor, which is fiscal year 20 to the current governor's recommendation, fiscal year 25, if the way they've reported the spending, it's up for the general fund for 35% cumulatively. But if you add the transfers, it's up about 54%. So, they're hiding spending, or at least trying to shift the spending. And there's another way we look at that, and that is the growth of the base budget. And the base budget is the ongoing component that goes year to year. And of course, it grows with additions, line items. And that's gone up, when you look at the dedicated and the general funds, about 42% these last 5 years, including the current recommendation. So that's the backdrop. And the governor has been saying that his budget this year is only going to go up 2% because he's transferring a lot of money, hundreds and hundreds of millions. So we've been pushing back against that. And as Niklas said, one of the ways that JFAC can get a handle on everything is to separate the budgets necessary to keep the lights on and the doors open from all the wants. And our understanding is right now, we thought that the issue is settled. There's some stuff behind the scenes going on because JFAC actually passed maintenance budgets, which total about $12.1 billion. And to Ron Nate's earlier point, that's still way more than when he was here, but it's a lot less than the governor got last year, which was $13.85 billion. So we're talking about 12.1. And it's about $1.5 billion less than the governor wants. So again, the maintenance budgets keep the functions of government operating, and the governor would like an extra $1.5 billion over that. And he's never really had that called out. And as we speak today on this call or on this X space, there's actually some consternation about how that's really going to happen and what's going to happen. But we're encouraged by the discussion of that process, and we hope that there's some follow through, because JFAC has actually, I wouldn't say appropriated, but what they do is they've passed 10 budget motions that become appropriations bills. And so those should be hitting the floor any time now. And once those do hit the floor, and if they pass, then the conversation can shift to how much, if any, of the optional stuff do we want. So that's kind of a little history on that whole process and why we need it. I guess I'll shift it back to Ron.
Thank you, Fred and Niklas. Excellent summaries. I just love the idea that JFAC has passed the maintenance budgets, which is, sometimes they call them going home bills, that you have to pass those to fund the government that exists. And then the governor wants another $1.5 billion on top of that. Well, that is more like optional stuff. And so if we could get the legislators to cut that in half, say, that would be probably the biggest tax cut in Idaho history if you look at what is available to send back to taxpayers instead of keep it in state government. We could end up under $13 billion instead of approaching $14 billion like we did last year. So there's some great opportunities in this budgeting process. And if you don't believe me, all you have to do is look at how the Democrats are reacting to this. They are all freaking out over this new budgeting process. And the big spenders want to spend. The conservatives don't want to spend as much. And so they get a chance to vote only on the increases instead of on the entire budget. And so that'll be an interesting process to see how it plays out. Another couple of issues that I wanted to touch on before we open this up to questions or additional comments from our Niklas and Fred budget team. The libraries bill was introduced, and but it seems the word on the street is the library bill that's been proposed and it's out there. I think it's 384 right now. It's probably not going to go anywhere. They're working on a different libraries bill. Just a little update on that. First of all, the 384 bill was not a great bill anyway. It didn't do much to stop the problem. It was a very small cause of action, and a parent would have to jump through multiple bureaucratic hoops to even get to the point where they could exercise a private cause of action. And we'll wait and see what the next library bill is. Apparently, it will have different sponsors, or at least one different sponsor, and it's supposed to I don't know if it's going to fix those problems or be even lighter, but here's two things to watch for on it. Number one, if the Library Association is supportive of the next libraries bill, that tells you it's not doing anything. It's not going to protect kids because the Library Association has been consistent on this. They want the freedom, they want the ability to use government facilities and government libraries to push harmful materials on children. And so they care more about their libraries and their system than they do about the kids. And number two is that if you look at the sponsors on this, sometimes sponsors are put on there for political reasons rather than for practical reasons or principled reasons. And I've heard that Senator Schroeder might be a sponsor on the next library bill. If that's the case, that's another red flag. Senator Schroeder was against the library bill last year. He hasn't been a defender of children. In fact, he's an avowed atheist, and we'll see where that heads. But I'm watching for the library bill. Also watching for school choice legislation. Representative Horman and Senator Den Hartog proposed an education tax credit early in the session, and that would provide a reimbursement to families, or actually a prepayment to families that qualify for private school tuition or private school expenses if they choose to go with the private school route, that they would have full school choice and be able to use that money, up to certain amounts. That's promising. This is school choice week, and so now's a good week to be talking about it. But in the past, every school choice proposal has been stopped dead in its tracks, either by squishy leadership or by the education establishment who wants to protect the public school system from any kind of real competition. But here's the thing, we're looking at children. Children deserve quality education. And what has proven to create quality education is competition in the field of education. Where school choice has been enacted, where it has been implemented, we've seen improvement in private schools, we've seen improvement in public schools, because competition drives the common good, because public schools who want to retain students will have to up their game. And also, I want to point this out too. Teachers tend to benefit from school choice as well, because not only are schools competing for students, they're also competing for good teachers. And so good teachers will find more offers and probably higher offers when school choice is fully implemented. So that's another good thing to look forward to. Those are the issues I'm looking at. Before we open it up to questions, I do want to turn the floor back to Fred for one little issue. Fred, if you don't mind, I'd like you to talk about that Medicaid reversion and the benefits that we saw from that early on, and how we could have saved Idaho taxpayer money for 1 year at least with the Medicaid reversion proposal from last year.
Thanks, Ron. I'd be happy to describe that. So for those of you that have been paying attention, Medicaid has it's really a rocket ship that's driving the state spending up more than any other program. And last session, the appropriations bill was about $4.7 billion, or I should say the agency request. And the agency made this request even though during COVID, the Biden administration had suspended any requirements, meaning everybody and anyone could sign up for Medicaid. They were presumed to be eligible, and there wouldn't be any discernment. You'd only get off if you died or you left the state. And we might even have had some dead people on for all we know. Well, when this COVID emergency ended, which is one of the reasons they dragged it on because it allowed them to do things like this, the people that were ineligible were supposed to, by law, because they're ineligible, be pushed off. Well, it took a lot of pressure from conservatives in the legislature, but after a lot of probing and poking by JFAC and other members, other conservatives, the then director Jepsen said, yes, we're reviewing. Yes, tens of thousands are ineligible. Yes, we're going to take them off, but they never adjusted their budget. So conservatives in the legislature in the House killed the original appropriation, meaning they voted it down. And they wanted to take several $100 million off. There were a number of different proposals. And ultimately, they had to settle for a reduction of only $150 million. And if that sounds like a lot, consider that each participant costs, on average, about $11,000 a year. So when you're talking about hundreds of thousands of participants, $150 million is not that much. And so conservatives said, this is not a big enough reduction. We're going to vote no. And they were told, oh, you can't cut more. If you do, there's going to be a supplemental, meaning there's going to be a shortage, more money will be needed. And so the bill ultimately passed by one vote in the Senate. It passed a little bigger margin in the House. Well, lo and behold, the governor and the agency are now asking for a reversion, meaning a reduction in the current fiscal year. This isn't the next one, the one we're sitting in, of about $278 million. And so basically they are confirming what conservatives said, which is when you take tens of thousands of people off a program, you actually save money. And it's not really clear why they didn't want to do this, other than maybe they thought that they would get away with this reversion and claim some sort of credit. But they're being very quiet about it now, simply because this is what conservatives brought up. So this was $278 million that the government hung on to and now is giving back to the general fund, and that's your money, by the way. So this is just further evidence that health and welfare is ill managed and it's not doing its job appropriately, which is matching revenue with actual expenses. So that's where we are, and that's one of the reasons why we're excited by this maintenance budget process. The agency shouldn't show up and say, here's what we need for everything. They should say, here's what we need to keep the lights on. And even that, in the case of health and welfare, I'm sure is a bloated number. And then let's have a constructive argument about whatever else we need, which I think, again, in the case of this agency, is nowhere near what they want. So that's kind of a summary, Ron.
Thank you, Fred. Before we open it up for questions, I do want to alert listeners and out there about Capitol Clarity this week. Thursday at noon in the Lincoln Auditorium, that's on the garden level of the Senate side of the Capitol building. Thursday at noon will be Senator Glenita Zeiderveld and Representative Josh Tanner. They're going to be talking about the Department of Health and Welfare, the mismanagement that's been happening there, and how we can hold them accountable. It's going to be fireworks. So come to Capitol Clarity on Thursday at noon. Other than that, I want to thank you all for tuning in, and just know that every Monday at 4 o'clock will be our legislative update. We'll update you on what's gone on the past week, what's coming on in the week week ahead, and so that you're ready to participate fully as citizens and know what's going on in your capital. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll hear from you and talk to you next week at 4 o'clock on Monday. Have a great day, everyone.